Section 6 of
of
1891 collection.
This
This is a
Mrs.
1891 collection. This is a
Mrs.
LibriVox
Manstey's
recording.
View
All
by
LibriVox
Edith
recordings
Wharton.
are in the public
This is a
domain.
LibriVox
For more
recording.
information or to
All
volunteer,
LibriVox
please
recordings
visit
are in the public domain.
LibriVox.org.
For more information or
Reading
to
by Matt
volunteer,
Perard.
please visit LibriVox.org.
1891 collection
Reading
by
by Matt
various.
Perard.
Section 6.
1891 collection
Americanisms
by
and
various.
Briticisms.
Section
by
5.
Brander
Mrs.
Matthews.
Manstey's View by Edith Wharton.
In a novel
As first
written in the
published in
last
Scrivener's
decade,
Magazine,
but one
July
of the
1891.
19th century, by an Australian lady,
The view
in
from Mrs.
collaboration with
Manstey's
a member
window
of
was
Parliament,
not a striking
one of the
one,
characters
but to her
stops
at
another
least it was
to
full
ask
of
for the
interest and
explanation
beauty.
of this or that
Mrs. Manstey
Australian phrase,
occupied the
wondering
back
whether
room
it
on the
would be
third floor
better
of a
to
New
give
York
the
boarding
English
house,
meaning of
in
each
a
word
street
after
where the
the
ash
word
barrels
itself,
lingered late
and to
on
keep
the
on repeating
sidewalk,
it all
and the
through.
gaps
Or
in
would
the
it do
pavement
to
would
put a
have staggered
footnote
acquaintance
once for all,
courteous.
or
She
how would
was
it
the widow
do
of a
to
clerk
have a
in a
little
large
glossary at
wholesale
the
house,
end?
and his death had
As it
left her
happens,
alone,
oddly
for her
enough,
only
the
daughter had
authors
married
of
in
the
California
Ladies' Gallery
and could not
have
afford
not
the long journey
themselves
to New
done
York
any
to see
one
her
of
mother.
these things,
Mrs.
and
Manstey,
therefore, if we
perhaps,
chance to
might
read
have
their
joined
fiction,
her daughter
we are
in the
left to
West,
grope
but
for
they had now
ourselves
been so
when,
many
in the
years
first two
apart
chapters, we
that
are
they had
told
ceased to
of
feel
the
any
wild
need of
howling of
each
the
other's
dingoes in
society,
the scrub,
and their
and
intercourse
when we
had long
learn
been
that the hero
limited to the
had
exchange of
eaten
a
his
few
evening meal,
perfunctory letters,
damper, and a
written
hard
with
junk of
indifference by the daughter,
wallaby
and with
flesh,
difficulty
while
by
his
Mrs.
billy
Manstey,
of tea
whose
was
right hand
warming.
was growing stiff
Then we
with
are
gout.
informed that he had
Even had she
arranged
felt
a
a
bed
stronger
with his
desire
blankets,
for her
his
daughter's
swag for a pillow,
companionship,
and
Mrs.
that he wished
Manstey's
for
increasing
a good mate
infirmity,
to share
which
his
caused her to
watch,
dread the
or
3
even a
flights of
black
stairs between her
tracker
room and
upon
the
whom
street,
he could
would
depend
have
as
given
a
her
scout.
pause on the eve
We
of
are told
undertaking
also
so
that this
long a
hero,
journey,
who was
and
not
without,
intended to grow
perhaps,
long,
formulating
hears
these
a call in
reasons,
the night,
she had long
and he
since
reflects
accepted,
that a
as a
black
matter of
fellow
course,
would
her
not
solitary
cooee
life
in that
in New
way.
York.
Later, he
She
cuts
was,
a fig
indeed,
of
not
tobacco.
quite lonely,
He
for a few
says,
friends
"We
still
can
toiled
yarn
up
now."
and
He
then
speaks
to
of
her
living on
room,
wild plums in a
but their visits
bandicoot,
grew rare
and he
as the
makes
years
mention
went
of a
by.
certain new
Mrs.
chum.
Manstey
From the
had never
context, we
been
may
a
fairly
sociable woman,
infer that
and
this
during her
last term
husband's
is the
lifetime
Australian
his
equivalent of the
companionship
Western
had been
tenderfoot.
all sufficient
But
to
who
her.
shall
For
explain the
many
meaning
years
of
she had
damper
cherished a
and
desire to
dingoes,
live in the country,
cooee and
to have a hen
bandicoot?
house and a garden,
And why have
but this
scrub
longing
and
had
billy,
faded with
grub
age,
and
leaving
fig
only in the
taken on
breast
new
of the
meanings, as
uncommunicative
though they had
old woman
suffered a sea
a vague
change in the
tenderness
long
for
voyage
plants
around the
and
Cape or
animals.
through the canal.
It was, perhaps,
As yet,
this
so far as I
tenderness
know,
which made
no
her
British
cling so
critic
fervently
has
to her
raised a
view
cry of
from
alarm
her
against the
window,
coming
a view in
degradation of
which
the
the
English
most
language by
optimistic
the
eye
invasion of
would at first have failed to
Australianisms.
discover anything
It can hardly be
admirable.
doubted,
Mrs.
however, that
Manstey,
the
from her
necessities
coign
of a new
of vantage,
civilization
a
will force
slightly
the
projecting
Australian
bow
to the
window,
making of
where she
many
nursed
a
an
new word
ivy,
to define
and
new
a
conditions.
succession of unwholesome
As the
looking
San
bulbs,
Francisco hoodlum
looked out
is
first
different
upon the
from the New
yard of
York
her own
loafer,
dwelling,
so
of
the
which,
Melbourne
however,
larrikin
she could get
has
but a
differentiated
restricted
himself
glimpse.
from the London
Still,
rough,
her gaze
and
took
in
in
due
the
season
topmost
a
boughs
term
of the
had to be developed to
ailanthus
denote
below her
this
window,
differentiation.
and she knew how early
There are
each year
also
the
not a
clump of
few
dicentery
Canadian
strung
phrases to be
its
collected by the
bending
curious,
stalk with
and the
hearts of
exiles in
pink.
India have
But of
evolved a
greater interest
vocabulary of
were the
their own
yards
by
beyond.
frequent adoption of
Being for the
native
most
words,
part
which makes
attached to
difficult the
boarding
reading of
houses,
certain
they
of
were in a
Mr.
state
Rudyard
of chronic
Kipling's earlier
untidiness and
tales.
fluttering on certain days of the week, with
To
miscellaneous
recall these
garments
things
and
is
frayed
but to recognize
tablecloths.
that the same
In
causes
spite of
are at
this,
work in
Mrs.
Canada,
Manstey
in
found much
India,
to
and
admire in
in
the long
Australia,
vista which
as
she
have been
commanded.
acting in the United
Some of the
States.
yards were,
It remains to
indeed,
be
but
seen whether
stony
the
wastes,
British
with
critic
grass
will
in the
show the
cracks of the
same
pavement,
intolerance
and
towards
no
the
shade in
colonial and
spring,
dependent
save that
Australian
afforded by
and
the
Canadian
intermittent leafage
that he has
of the
been wont to show
clotheslines.
towards the
These yards
independent
Mrs.
American.
Manstey
The
disapproved of,
controversy,
but the
when it
others,
comes,
the
is
green
one
ones,
at which
she
the
loved.
American will look on
She
with
had grown used to
disinterested
their
amusement,
disorder,
remembering
the
that
broken
those laugh
barrels, the
best
empty
who laugh
bowls and
last,
paths
and that
unswept,
Dean
no
Alford
longer
omitted from
annoyed
the
her.
later editions of
Hers
his
was the happy
dogmatic
faculty of
discussion
dwelling dwelling on the
the Queen's
pleasanter
English,
side of
a
the
passage
prospect
which
before
was
her.
prominent in the first edition,
In the very
issued
next
in
enclosure, did
1863,
not a
during the
magnolia
War
open
of the
its
Rebellion,
hard white
in
flowers
which
against the
animadverted
watery blue
on the
of April?
process of
And was there
deterioration
not A little way
that the
down the
Queen's
line,
English had
a
undergone at
fence
the
foamed
hands of the
over every
Americans.
May
Look at those
by
phrases, he
lilac
cried,
waves
which
of
so amuse
wistaria.
us in their speech and
Farther
books,
still,
at their
a horse
reckless
chestnut
exaggeration and
lifted its
contempt for
candelabra of
congruity,
buff and
and
pink
then compare the
blossoms
character and
above
history of the
broad
nation,
fans of
its
foliage,
blunted sense of
while in
moral
the opposite
obligation
yard
and duty to
June
man,
was
its
sweet
open
with the breath
disregard of
of a
conventional
neglected
right, where
syringa, which
aggrandizement
persisted
is to
in
be
growing in
obtained,
spite of the
and I may
countless
now say
obstacles
its
opposed to
reckless
its
and
welfare.
fruitless
But
maintenance
if nature
of the most
occupied the front
cruel
rank
and
in Mrs.
unprincipled
Manstey's
war
view,
in the
there
history
was
of the
much
world.
of a more personal
Time can
character
be
to interest
relied
her
on to
in the
quash
aspect of the
an
house and
indictment
their inmates.
against a nation,
She
and we
deeply
Americans
disapproved of the
should be sorry to
mustard-colored
think that
curtains
there
which
are
had lately
today
been hung
in
in the
England
doctor's
any of
window
those
opposite.
who in
But she glowed
1863
with pleasure when the
sympathized
house
with the Dean
farther
of
down
Canterbury,
had its
and who
old
are not
bricks
now
washed with a
heartily
coat of
ashamed of
paint.
their attitude then,
The occupants of the houses did not often show
owing, it
themselves
may
at the
be,
back
to the
windows,
consciousness of
but the
strength,
servants were
which
always
is
in
a
sight.
precious result of the
Noisy
war. The
slatterns,
British
Mrs.
clergyman
Manstey
denounced
pronounced the
thus
greater number.
eloquently. The
She
last
knew
tie of
their ways and
colonialism which
hated them.
bound us to the mother
But to
country
the
is
quiet
broken.
cook in the
We
newly
know
painted
now
house,
that
whose
the mother
mistress
tongue is a
bullied her,
heritage,
and
and
who
not
secretly
alone.
fed the stray cats at
It
nightfall,
is ours
Mrs.
to use
Manstey's
as we
warmest
needs
sympathies
must.
were given.
In America, there
On
is
one
no
occasion
necessity
her
to
feelings were
plead for the
racked by
right
the
of the
neglect of a
Americanism to
housemaid,
exist.
who,
The
for 2
cause
days,
is won.
forgot to feed the
No
parrot
American
committed
writer
to her
worth his
care.
salt would think of
On the
withdrawing a
third day,
word,
Mrs.
or
Manstey,
of
in spite
apologizing
of her
for a
gouty
phrase,
hands,
because it
had
was not
just penned
current
a
within
letter
sound of
beginning,
bow
"Madam,
bells.
it is now
The
3
most
days
timid of
since your
American
parrot has been
authoresses
fed,"
has no
when the
doubt
forgetful
as to
maid
her use
appeared at
of
the window with a
railroad,
cup of seed in
conductor,
her hand.
grade, and to
But
switch,
in Mrs. Manstey's more
despite her possible
meditative
knowledge
moods,
that in
it was
British
the
usage
narrowing
the
perspective of
equivalents
far
of these
off
words
yards
are
which pleased her
railway,
best.
guard,
She loved,
gradient,
at
and
twilight,
to
when the
shunt.
distant brown
On the
stone
contrary,
spire
in
seemed
fact, there is
melting in the
visible
fluid
now and
yellow of
again,
the west,
especially on the
to
part
lose
of the most
herself in
highly
vague memories of
cultivated
a trip
writers,
to Europe,
an obvious
made
delight
years
in
ago,
grasping an
and now
indigenous
reduced in her
word,
mind's eye
racing
to a
soil.
pale
There is
phantasmagoria
many
of
an American
indistinct
expression of
steeples
a
and dreamy
pungent
skies.
freshness, which
Perhaps,
authors,
at heart,
weary of an
Mrs. Manstey
outworn
was an
vocabulary,
artist. At
seize
all
eagerly.
events, she was
It
sensible
may
of
be a
many
new word,
changes of
but
color
it would not be
unnoticed
in
by
accord
the
with
average
our
eye,
traditions to
and
refuse
dear to her as
naturalization
the green
to a
of early
welcome
spring
newcomer.
was the black
Or
lattice
it may
of
be a
branches
survival,
against a cold
flourishing
silver
here in
sky
our open
at the close
fields,
of a snowy
although long
day.
since rooted out of
She
the Trim
enjoyed,
Islands
also,
garden
the
on the other
sunny
side of
thaws
the
of
Atlantic,
March, when
and
patches
in
of
such
earth
case we
showed
use
through
it
the snow like ink
unhesitatingly
spots
today,
spreading on a
as our
sheet of white
forefathers used
blotting
it
paper.
in the past,
And,
following,
better
as
still,
Lowell
the
remarks,
haze of
the
boughs,
fashion of our
leafless but
ancestors,
swollen,
who
which replaced
unhappily
the
could bring
clear-cut
over no
tracery
English
of
better
winter.
than Shakespeare's.
She
In
even
the preface
watched
to the
with a
first
certain
edition of his
interest the
dictionary,
trail of
issued
smoke
in
from a far-off
1825,
factory
Noah
chimney, and
Webster
missed a
declared
detail
that
in the
although
landscape
in
when the
America
factory was
the
closed
body of the
and the smoke
language is the same
disappeared.
as in England,
Mrs.
and is
Manstey,
desirable
in the
to
long hours
perpetuate
which she
that
spent at
sameness,
her window,
yet some
was not
differences
idle.
must
She
exist,
read a little
since
and knitted
language is the
numberless
expression of
stockings,
ideas,
but the
and if
view
the people of
surrounded
one
and shaped
country
her
cannot
life
preserve
as the
an
sea does a
identity of
lonely island.
ideas,
When
the
her rare
people of another
callers
country,
came, it was
they are
difficult
not
for
likely
her to
to retain
detach
an
herself
absolute
from the
identity of
contemplation
language,
of the
and
opposite
Webster
window
had no
washing,
difficulty in showing
or the
that
scrutiny
differences of
of
physical
certain
and
green
political
points
conditions
in a
had
neighboring flower
already,
bed,
in his
which
day,
might, or
only
might
half a
not,
century after
turn
the
into
Revolution,
hyacinths,
and when the
while
center
she
of
feigned an
population was
interest
still
in her
close to the
visitor's
Atlantic seaboard,
anecdotes about
produced
some unknown
differences of
grandchild.
speech. It is too much
Mrs.
to expect,
Manstey's real
perhaps,
friends were
that
the
the British
denizens of the
critic shall
yards,
look at
the
this
hyacinths,
Yankee
the
independence
magnolia,
from
the
our
green
point of view.
parrot, the maid who fed
Professor
the cats,
Lounsbury
the
tells us
doctor
in
who
his
studied late
admirable
behind his
biography
mustard-colored
that in
curtains,
Fenimore
and the
Cooper's time
confidant of
the
her tender
attitude of the
musings
Englishman
was the
towards the
church
American,
spire floating
in the
in the
most
sunset.
favorable cases,
One
was
April day, as she
supercilious and
sat in her
patronizing,
usual place,
an attitude
with
which
knitting
never
cast
permits
aside
the
and
nation
eyes fixed on the blue
criticizing
sky,
to
mottled
understand
with
the
brown
nation
clouds,
criticized.
a knock at the door
Things have
announced
changed
the
for the better
entrance
since
of her
Cooper was
landlady.
almost alone in his
Mrs.
stalwart
Manstey did not
Americanism,
care for her
but the
landlady,
arrogance
but
which
she
General
submitted to her
Braddock of His
visits with
Majesty's
ladylike
Army showed
resignation.
towards Colonel Washington
Today,
of the
however, it
Virginia
seemed harder
contingent
than usual to
survives
turn
here
from the
and
blue
there in
sky
Great Britain,
and the blossoming
even though
magnolia
another dean
to Mrs.
sits in
Sampson's
Dr. Alford's
unsuggestive
stall
face,
in
and
Canterbury
Mrs. Manstey
Cathedral.
was conscious of a distinct effort as she
It
did so.
prompted a British novelist not long
The
ago to
magnolia
be
is out earlier
offensively
than usual
impertinent
this
to
year,
an
Mrs.
American lady,
Sampson, she remarked,
Athenaeum,
yielding
September
to a
1st,
rare impulse,
1888,
for she seldom
and it
alluded to the
allowed
absorbing
Lord
interests of her
Wolsey
life.
to insult
In
the
the first
memory of
place,
Robert
it
E.
was a
Lee with
topic not
ignorant
likely to
praise.
appeal to her
It finds
visitors,
expression
and besides,
in a
she
passage
lacked the
like the
power of
following
expression,
from a
and could
primer
not
of
have
English
given
composition
utterance to her
by
feelings
Mr. John
had she wished
Nichols.
to. The what,
Americanisms
Mrs.
as
Manstey?
Britisher,
Inquired the landlady,
skedaddle, and the
glancing
peculiar
about the
use
room
of
as if to
flipper,
find there the
calculate,
explanation of
guess,
Mrs. Manstey's
reckon,
statement.
etc., with the
The
mongrel
magnolia in the
speech
next
adopted
yard,
by some
in Mrs.
humorists,
Black's
are
yard,
only
Mrs.
admissible
Manstey
in
repeated.
satirical pictures of
Is it
American
indeed?
manners.
I didn't
Page
know there was a
35.
magnolia
When
there,
we read an
said
assertion of
Mrs.
this sort,
Sampson,
we are
carelessly.
reduced to believe
Mrs.
that it
Manstey
must be
looked at
the
her.
dampness
She
of the
did not
British
know
climate which
there was a
has thus
magnolia
rusted the
in the
hinges
next
of
yard.
British manners.
By the way, Mrs.
Far
Sampson
more often
continued,
than we could wish
speaking of Mrs.
can we
Black
hear the
reminds
note
me
of
that the
lofty
work on the
condescension in
extension
British
is to
discussion
begin
of the
next week.
peculiarities of other
The
races.
what?
When
It was
Englishmen are
Mrs.
forced to
Manstey's turn
compare
to ask.
themselves with men of
The
any other country,
extension,
no doubt
said
it
Mrs.
must be
Sampson,
difficult for them not
nodding
to
her head in the
plume
direction of
themselves
the
on their
ignored
superior
magnolia.
virtue.
You knew, of course, that
Modesty
Mrs. Black was
is
going to
also
build an
a
extension
virtue,
to her
and if this
house.
were
Yes,
more
ma'am.
often
I hear
cultivated
it
in
is to
Great
run
Britain, the
right back
French,
to the end
for
of the
example,
yard.
would
How
have
she
fewer
can
occasions for
afford to build
making
an
pointed
extension in
remarks
these our
about
times,
la
I don't
morgue
see. But
Britannique.
she always was
Even the
crazy about
gentle
building.
Thackeray,
She used to
if
keep a boarding
the
house in
excursus
17th
may be
Street,
forgiven,
and
is
she
not wholly
nearly
free
ruined
from
herself
failing.
then by
In
sticking out
spite of
bow
his
windows
familiarity
and
with
what not.
French life and
I
French
should have
art,
thought
he could not
that
quite
would have
divest
cursed her
himself
of
of
building,
his British
but I guess
pride
it's
and
a
of the
disease,
intolerance which
like drink.
accompanies it, and therefore we find
Anyhow,
him
the
recording
work
that
is to begin on
Monsieur
Monday.
de Florac
Mrs.
confided
Manstey
gaily
had
to
grown
Mr.
pale.
Clive
She
Newcome
always
the
spoke
reason why
slowly,
he
so the
preferred the
landlady
coffee
did
at the
not heed the
hotel
long
to the
pause
coffee
which
at the
followed.
great café,
At
with
last,
a
Mrs.
Doris
Manstey
Eugène
said,
in rebus
"Do
et de
you know
ça,
how high the
pronounced in the
extension
true
will
French
be?
manner." Newcome's
That's the most
chapter
absurd
28.
part of it. The extension is to be built
But how should a
right up to
Frenchman
the roof
pronounce
of the main
Latin?
building. Now, did
Like
you
an
ever?"
Englishman, perhaps? When
Mrs.
even the
Manstey
kindly
paused
Thackeray
again.
is capable of a
"Won't it
sneering
be a great
insularity of
annoyance
this
to you,
sort,
Mrs.
it is
Sampson?"
small wonder
she
that the
asked.
feeling of the
"I
French
should say
towards
it
the British
would,
is well
but there's no
expressed
help
in the
for
final
it.
line of
If
the
people have got
quatrain
a mind to
inscribed
build
over the gate at
extensions, there's no
Compiègne,
law to prevent 'em that I'm
through
aware
which
of."
Joan d'Arc
Mrs.
went
Manstey,
to her
knowing
capture.
this, was silent.
Tout
"There
cela
is no
d'Adrien
help
non fait
for
le
it,"
bien
Mrs.
jamais,
Sampson
and we
repeated.
are reminded
"But
of the
if
English
I
lady
am
who was
a
taken to
church
see
member,
Mr.
I
Jefferson's
wouldn't be so
performance of
sorry if
Rip
it
Van
ruined
Winkle,
Eliza
and who liked
Black.
it very much
Well, good
indeed,
day,
but
Mrs.
thought it such
Manstey.
a pity
I'm glad to
that the
find you so
actor had so
comfortable."
strong an American accent. Ignorance
"So
of his neighbor
comfortable,
is the character
so
of the
comfortable."
typical John Bull,
Left to herself,
says Mr.
the
R.
old
L.
woman
Stevenson,
turned once
who
more
also
to the window.
declares that
How
the
lovely the
Englishman
view
sits
was
apart,
that day!
bursting with
The
pride
blue
and
sky with
ignorance.
its round
What a Scot
clouds
has
shed a
written, a
brightness
Yankee
over
may
everything.
quote,
The
and the
ailanthus
quotation
had put
has
on a tinge
pertinence
of
here
yellow
in
green.
view of the
The
fact that in the
hyacinths
last
were
century
budding.
the
The
English were
magnolia
just as
flowers
keen
looked more
against
than ever like
Scotticisms
rosettes
and
carved in
Hibernicisms,
alabaster.
and just as
Soon the
bitter
wistaria
as
would
they
bloom,
have been
then the
in
horse
this century
chestnut,
against
but not for her.
Americanisms, and as they may
Between
be
her
in the
eyes
next
and them
against
a barrier of
Australianisms.
brick and mortar would
Macaulay
swiftly
asserted
rise.
that there were
Presently
in
even the spire
Marmion
would
and in
disappear, and
Waverley
all her radiant
Scotticisms
world be
at which
blotted out.
a London apprentice
Mrs.
would
Manstey set
laugh,
away
and there are
untouched the
to be
dinner
seen
tray
in the
brought to
English
her that evening.
newspapers now and
She
again
lingered in the
petty
window
attacks on
until
the
the
style
windy
and
sunset
vocabulary
died
of
in
American
bat-colored
authors of
dust.
distinction,
Then, going to
which it
bed,
is
she lay
perhaps
sleepless all
charitable to
night.
credit to London
Early the next day
One of
she was
these
up
it was no
and at the
doubt who
window.
began a
It was
review of
raining,
Mr.
but even
Brownell's
through the
subtle and
slanting
profound
gray
study
gauze
of French
the scene
traits,
had its
with
charm.
the statement
And
that
then the
the
rain was so
language
good for the
most
trees.
depressing to the
She had
educated
noticed the day
Englishman
before that
is the
the
language of the
ailanthus
cultured
was growing
American.
dusty.
Probably
"Of
the
course
small
I
sword
might
will
move,"
always be
said
exasperating
Mrs.
to
Manstey
those who cling
aloud,
to the boxing
and
glove.
turning from the
When
window,
a
she
London
looked about her
apprentice
room.
laughs at the
She might move,
Scotticisms of the
of
North
course.
Briton, and when the
So
London
might she be
Athenaeum is
flayed
depressed by
alive.
the language of cultured
But
Americans,
she was not
there is
likely
to
to
be
survive
discovered behind
either
the laugh
operation.
and the scoff
The
an
room,
assumption
though
that
far
any
less
departure from
important
the
to her
usage
happiness
which
than the view,
obtains in
was as
London
much
is
a part of
most
her
deplorable.
existence.
The
She had
laugh
lived in
and
it
the scoff
17
are the
years.
outward and
She knew
visible
every
signs of an
stain on
inward
the
and
wallpaper,
spiritual
every
belief
rent
that the
in the carpet.
Londoner is the
The light
sole
fell
guardian
in a
and
certain way
trustee
on her
of the English
engravings.
language.
Her books had
But
grown
this is
shabby
a
on their
belief for
shelves.
which there
Her
is no
bulbs and
foundation
ivy
whatever.
were
The
used to their
English
window
language
and knew
is
which
not
way to lean
bankrupt
to the
that
sun.
it needs to have a receiver
"We are all
appointed.
too
It is
old
quite
to
capable
move,"
of minding
she
its
said.
own
That
business
afternoon
without the
it
care of a
cleared,
committee of
wet
Englishmen.
and radiant. The
If
blue
indeed a
reappeared through
guardian
torn
were
rags of
necessary,
cloud.
what Englishman
The
would it
ailanthus
be who
sparkled.
would best
The earth
preserve
and the flower
our
borders
pure
looked
English?
rich and
The
warm.
shepherd of Dorset
It
or
was
the miner
Thursday,
of
and on
Northumberland?
Monday the
The
building of the
Yorkshireman
extension
or the
was
Cockney?
to begin.
If it is not the London
On
apprentice
Sunday
who is to
afternoon
set the
a card
standard,
was brought to
but the
Mrs. Black,
Englishman of
as
breeding,
she was
it is hard to
engaged in
discover the
gathering up the
ground
fragments
whereon
of the
this
boarder's dinner
Englishman
in the
can
basement.
claim
The
superiority of
card,
taste or
black
knowledge
edged,
over the
bore
other
Mrs. Manstey's
educated
name.
men to whom English is the mother tongue,
One of
whether they were
Mrs.
born
Sampson's
in
boarders
Scotland,
wants to
Ireland,
move,
or
I
America,
suppose.
in
Well, I can give
Australia,
her a room
India,
next
or
year at the
Canada.
extension.
The
"Dinah,"
fallacy of
said
the
Mrs.
Englishman,
Black, "tell the
be
lady
he
I'll be
London
upstairs in a
apprentice
minute."
or contributor
Mrs.
to
Black
the
found
Athenaeum,
Mrs.
is
Manstey
that he
standing in the
erects a
long
merely
parlour,
personal standard
garnished
in
with
the use of
statuettes
our
and
language.
antimacassars.
He
In
compares
that
the
house
English
she
he
could not
finds in the
sit down.
novels of a Scotchman or in the
Stooping
essays of
hurriedly
an
to open the
American with
register,
that
which
which he
let out a
hears about
cloud
him
of
daily
dust,
in London,
Mrs. Black advanced on her visitor.
animadverting upon
"I'm
every
happy to meet you,
divergence from
Mrs.
this
Manstey.
local
Take a
British
seat,
usage
please,"
as a departure
the
from the
landlady
strict
remarked in
letter
her
of the law
prosperous voice,
which
the
governs
voice of
our
a woman who
language.
can afford
It
to
is,
build
of
extensions.
course, unfair to
There was no
suggest
help
that
for
a
it.
parochial
Mrs. Manstey sat down.
self-satisfaction underlies this
"Is there anything I
brutalization
can
of
do for
personal
you, ma'am?"
experience as a
Mrs.
sole
Black
test of
continued.
linguistic
"My house is
propriety.
full at
But the
present, but
procedure
I
is
am going to build
amusingly
an extension,
illogical.
and—" "It
The Cockney
is
has
about the
no monopoly
extension
of
that I
good
wish to
English,
speak,"
if even
said
he
Mrs.
has his
Manstey
full portion.
suddenly. "I
The
am a poor
Englishman
woman,
in
Mrs.
England
Black,
is
and
but
I
the
have
elder
never
brother
been
of the
a happy one.
Anglo-Saxon
I shall have to
elsewhere,
talk about
and by
myself
no right
first,
of
to
primogeniture
make you understand."
does he control the language
Mrs.
which is
Black,
our
astonished
birthright.
but
Noah
imperturbable,
Webster, in the
bowed
preface
at
from
this
which
parenthesis.
quotation has
"I never
already
had
been
what I
made,
wanted,"
remarked that
Mrs. Manstey
American
continued.
authors had a
"It was always
tendency to
one
write
disappointment
the
after
language
another.
in its
For
genuine
years I wanted
idiom,
to live in the country.
and he
I
asserted
dreamed
that,
and dreamed
in
about it,
this respect,
but we never could
Franklin and
manage it.
Washington, whose
There was
language
no
is
sunny
their
window in
hereditary
our
mother
house,
tongue,
and so all my
unsophisticated
plants
by
died.
modern grammar,
My daughter
present
married
as
years
pure
ago
models
and
of
went away.
genuine English
Besides,
as
she never
Addison
cared
or
for the
Swift.
same things.
It may
Then
be
my
doubted
husband
whether
died and I
English is
was
now
left
more
alone.
vigorously
That
spoken
was
or
17
better
years
understood
ago.
in
I
London
went to
than in New
live
York
at Mrs.
or in
Sampson's,
Melbourne,
and I have been
but
there
it
ever
is
since. I
indisputable
have grown a
that the
little
student
infirm, as you
detects
see,
in the
and I
ordinary
don't get
speech of
out
the
often,
Englishman
only
many
on
a
fine
lapse from the
days,
best
if I
usage.
am feeling
This
very well.
contaminating of the well
So
of
you can
English
understand my sitting a
undefiled
great deal
is
at my
not to be
window,
defended
the back
because
window,
it is
on the
due
3rd
to
floor.
Englishmen who happen to live in
"Well,
England. The
Mrs.
blunder made
Manstey,"
in Great
said
Britain
Mrs. Black
is to be
liberally,
stigmatized
"I
as
could
a
give you a back
Briticism,
room, I dare
and
say,
it is to
one of the
be
new
avoided
rooms in
by
the
those
X.
who take
But I
thought
don't
of their
want to
speech,
move. I
just as though
can't
the
move," said Mrs.
impropriety
Manstey,
were a
almost with a
Scotticism
scream.
or a
"And I came to
Hibernicism,
tell you
an
that if you build
Americanism
that
or an
extension I shall have
Australianism,
no view from my
when a
window.
locution of the
No
London
view.
apprentice
Do
is
you
not in accord with
understand?"
the principles of the language,
Mrs.
there is no
Black thought
prejudice in its
herself
favor
face to face with
because
a
it happened
lunatic,
to
and she had
arise
always
beside
heard
the
that
Thames
lunatics
rather
must
than
be
on the
humoured.
shores of the Hudson or
"Dear
by the
me,
banks of the St.
dear me,"
Lawrence.
she remarked, pushing
Of
her chair back a
Briticisms
little
there
way.
are as
"That
many
is
and
too
as
bad,
worthy of
isn't
collection
it?
and
Why, I never thought of
collocation
that.
as were
To
the
be
most
sure,
of the
the extension
Americanisms the
will
all-embracing
interfere with your
Bartlett
view, Mrs.
gathered into
Manstey.
his dictionary.
You
Indeed,
do
if a
understand,
Scot or a
Mrs.
Yankee were to
Manstey
prepare a
gasped.
glossary of
Of course I
Briticisms
do.
on
And
the
I'm real
ample
sorry about
scale
it, too.
adopted
But
by
there,
Mr.
don't you
Bartlett,
worry, Mrs.
and with the
Manstey.
same
I guess we can
generous
fix that all
hospitality,
right.
the result
Mrs.
would
Manstey rose from her
surprise no
seat.
one more than
Mrs.
the
Black
Englishman.
slipped
We
toward
should
the
find in
door.
its pages many a
What
word
do you
and
mean by
phrase and
fixing
turn
it?
of speech
Do you mean that
common
I can
enough in
induce you
England,
to change your
and
mind
quite
about
foreign
the
to the
extension?
best usage of
Oh,
those who
Mrs.
speak
Black,
English?
listen to me. I have
Briticisms,
$2,000
as
in the
worthy
bank,
of
and I could
reproof as
manage.
the
I
worst
know I could
specimen
manage to
of
give you
the mongrel
1,000
speech
if.
adopted by some
Mrs. Manstey
humorists in
paused.
America.
The tears were rolling down
These
her
are to be
cheeks.
sought rather
There,
in
there,
the
Mrs.
written
Manstey,
language
don't you
than in
worry,
oral speech,
repeated Mrs. Black soothingly.
though there
I
are
am sure we can
Briticisms
settle it.
aplenty
I am
in the
sorry
talk of
that
the
I can't
Londoner,
stay and talk about it
from
any
the
longer,
suppression
but this
of
is
the
such a
initial
busy
H
time of
among the
day with
masses
supper
to
to
the
get.
dropping of the final G
Her
among
hand
the
was on the
classes.
doorknob, but with sudden
Of a
vigor
truth,
Mrs.
precision
Manstey
of
seized her
speech
wrist.
is not frequent
You
in
are
London,
not
and not
giving me a
seldom the
definite
delivery
answer.
of the
Do you
Englishman
mean to
of
say that
education
you accept my
nowadays may
proposition?
fairly be called slovenly.
Why,
As I
I'll think
recall
it
the
over,
list of
Mrs.
those
Manstey.
whom I have
Certainly I
heard
will.
use the
I
English
wouldn't annoy
language
you
with
for the
familiar
world.
ease and elegance, I
But the
find
work is to
fewer
begin tomorrow,
Englishmen than
I am
either
told,
Scotchmen or
Mrs. Manstey
Americans.
persisted.
Quintilian
Mrs.
tells us
Black
that an old
hesitated.
Athenian woman
It shan't
called the
begin.
eloquent
I promise you that. I'll
Theophrastus
send
a
word to the
stranger,
builder this
and
very night.
declared
Mrs.
that
Manstey
she had discovered
tightened
him to
her
be a
hold.
foreigner,
You are not
only from his
deceiving me,
speaking
are
in a
you?
manner
She
too
said.
Attic.
No, no,
Something of this
stammered
ultra
Mrs. Black.
precision
How
is
can you
perhaps
think
to
such
be
a thing of me,
observed
Mrs.
today in the
Manstey?
modern Athens, be it at
Slowly, Mrs.
Edinburgh
Manstey's
or
clutch relaxed,
Boston.
and she passed through the
In the
open
ordinary
door.
speech of Englishmen,
$1,000,
there
she
are not a
repeated,
few
pausing
vocables
in the
which
hall.
grate on
Then she
American
let herself
ears.
out of the house
Sometimes
and
they are
hobbled down the
ludicrous.
steps, supporting
Sometimes they
herself on the
are
cast iron
hideous.
railing.
Sometimes they seem to us
My
simply strange.
goodness! Exclaimed Mrs.
Thus,
Black,
when Matthew
shutting and
Arnold
bolting
wrote
the hall
about
door.
Tolstoy,
I
he
never
told us
knew
that
the old
Anna
woman was
Karenina
crazy.
throws herself
And she
under
looked
the
so
wheels
quiet
of
and
a goods
ladylike,
train.
too.
To us Americans this sounds
Mrs.
odd,
Manstey
as
slept
it
well
is
that
our
night,
habit
but
to
early
call
the
the
next
means of
morning she was
self-destruction
awakened by a sound of
chosen by
hammering.
the Russian
She
heroine
got to her
a freight
window
train.
with what haste she
But
might,
it is
and,
simply due
looking out,
to the
saw that
accidental
Mrs. Black's
evolution of
yard was
railroad
full of
terminology
workmen.
in England and in
Some
America
were
at the
carrying
same
loads
time,
of brick from
whereby
the
the same
kitchen to the
thing
yard,
came to be called
others
by a
beginning to
different name on
demolish
either
the
side of the
old-fashioned
Atlantic.
wooden balcony which
Neither
adorned
term
each
has a right
story
of way
of Mrs.
as
Black's
against the other,
house.
and it would be
Mrs.
interesting to
Manstey saw
foresee
that
which will
she
get
had been
down to our
deceived.
great
At
grandchildren.
first she
In
thought of
like manner,
confiding her trouble to Mrs.
Achilles'
Sampson,
watch
but a
of Great
settled
Britain is
discouragement
the
soon took
stem-winder of the
possession of
United
her,
States.
and she went back
And
to
here,
bed,
again,
not
there is
caring to
little
see
to
what was
choose,
going
as
on.
both words are logical.
Toward
The
afternoon,
use of
however,
like
feeling that she
for
must know the
as,
worst,
not
she
uncommon
rose
in
and
the Southern
dressed
States,
herself.
has there
It
always
was a
been regarded
laborious
as
task,
an
for her hands were
individual
stiffer than usual,
colloquialism.
and the hooks and
But in
buttons
England
seemed
it is
to
heard
evade
in the
her. When
conversation
she
of
seated
literary
herself in the
men
window,
of
she
high
saw that the
standing,
workmen had
and now and
removed
again it
the upper
even gets
part of the
itself
balcony,
into
and that
print
the
in
bricks
books of
had
good
multiplied
repute.
since morning.
It will be found,
One of the
for
men, a
instance,
coarse
in the
fellow with a
sketch of
bloated
Macaulay,
face,
which
picked
the
a
late Potter
magnolia blossom
Morrison wrote for
and,
the series
after
of
smelling it,
Englishmen
threw it to
of
the
letters,
ground. The
edited by
next
Mr.
man,
John
carrying
Morley,
a load of bricks,
and
trod on
Walter
the flour
Bagehot
in passing.
represents the dwellers in the old
"Look
manor
out, Jim!"
houses and
called one of
rural
the men to another
parsonages,
who was smoking a
asking,
pipe. "If
why
you throw
can't
matches
they,
around
the
near
French,
those barrels
have
of paper,
kings, lords,
you'll have the
and
old
commons,
tinder box
like we
burning
have?
down before you know it."
Here occasion serves to
And
remark
Mrs.
that
Manstey,
Bagehot's
leaning
own
forward,
writing is
perceived that
besprinkled
there
with
were
Briticisms.
several barrels of
His
paper and
style is
rubbish
slouchy
under the
beyond
wooden
belief.
balcony.
It is impossible to
At
imagine a
length the
Frenchman
work
or an
ceased,
American
and twilight
capable
fell.
of thinking
The
as
sunset
clearly
was
and as
perfect, and a
cogently
roseate
as
light,
Bagehot,
transfiguring
and
the
willing to
distant
write as
spire,
carelessly. To be
lingered
noted
late
also
in the
is the
west.
British habit of saying
When it grew
"very
dark,
pleased"
Mrs. Manstey
when the tradition of the
drew
language
down the
and the best
shades and
American
proceeded,
usage
in
alike
her usual
require one
methodical
to say
manner,
"very
to light
much
her lamp.
pleased."
She
Equally
always
noteworthy is the
filled and
misuse
lit
of
it with her own
"without,"
hands,
for
keeping a
"unless,"
kettle of
condemned in
kerosene on a
America as a
zinc-covered shelf
vulgarism,
in a closet.
but
As the
discoverable in
lamplight
England
filled the
in the
room,
pages
it
of
assumed its
important
usual
periodical
peaceful aspect.
publications.
The
For
books and
example, in the
pictures and
number of the
plans
New Review for
seemed,
August,
like their mistress,
1890,
to
we
settle
find
themselves
Sir
down
Charles
for
Dillon,
another quiet
who,
evening,
as a
and
member of
Mrs.
Her
Manstey,
Majesty's
as
Privy
was her wont,
Council,
drew up her
ought to be
armchair
familiar
returned
with
to the
Queen's
table
English,
and began to knit.
writing that nothing can be brought before
That
the
night
vestry
she could not
without
sleep.
the vestry
The weather
is
had
duly
changed,
summoned.
and a wild wind was abroad, blotting
Among
the
these
stars
political
with close
Briticisms
driven
which
clouds.
deserve collection,
Mrs.
as well
Manstey
as
rose once or
political
twice and looked
Americanisms,
out of the
although far
window,
less
but of the
picturesque,
view
are to be
nothing was
recorded the
discernible,
use of
save a
the
tardy light
government,
or two in
when
the
the
opposite
ministry,
windows.
rather, is
These lights
intended,
at last went
and
out,
also the
and
habit
Mrs.
of
Manstey,
accepting
who had
these
watched
nouns of
for their
multitude as
extension,
plural,
began
and
to dress
therefore of
herself.
writing the
She was
ministry
in
are
evident
and
haste,
the
for she
government
merely
are,
flung a thin
where
dressing
an
gown over
American
her
would more
nightdress
naturally
and
write
wrapped her
the
head in a scarf.
administration is.
Then she opened her
Another
closet
more
and
recent
cautiously took out
Briticism
the
is the
kettle of
growing habit
kerosene.
of dropping the article and saying that
Having slipped a
ministers
bundle of
are,
wooden
meaning
matches into her
thereby
pocket,
that the
she
cabinet as a
proceeded,
whole is
with
about to take
increasing
action.
precautions, to
As
unlock her
yet I
door,
have not
and a
seen
few moments later she
ministers
was feeling
is,
her way down
but
the
even
dark
this barbaric
staircase,
locution
led by
bids
a glimmer
fair
of
to
gas
be
from the
reached
lower
in
hall.
course
At
of
length
time.
she reached the bottom of the stairs and began the
It
more
must be
difficult
admitted that the
descent into the
terminology of
utter
politics
darkness of
is
the basement.
independent in its
Here,
tendencies, and
however, she
frequently
could move
breaks the
more
slate
freely,
of the
as there
regular
was less
grammar.
danger of
It
being
was the speech
overheard,
making
and
of an
without much
American
delay
senator which
she
appeared to
contrived
the
to
late George
unlock
T.
the iron
Lanigan
door
as
leading
a
into the
foretaste
yard.
of that
A
grammatical
gust of cold
millennium
wind
when
smote
the
her as
singular
she
verb
stepped out
shall
and
lie
groped
down with the
shiveringly
plural
under the
noun,
clothesline.
and a little conjunction shall lead
That
them.
morning, at 3 o'clock, an
Perhaps
alarm of
the two
fire
most
brought the
frequent
engines to Mrs.
Briticisms and the
Black's
most
door,
obvious
and
are the
also
use
brought
of
Mrs. Sampson's
different
startled
to,
boarders to
where
their
the
windows.
American more
The wooden
appropriately and
balcony at the
logically
back of
says
Mrs.
different
Black's house
from,
was
and
ablaze,
the
and
employment
among
of
those who watched
directly
the
and its
progress of the
synonym
flames
immediately,
was Mrs.
or
Manstey,
as
leaning in her
soon
thin
as,
dressing
in
gown
such
from the
phrases
open
as
window.
directly he
The
arrived
fire,
did thus.
however, was soon put
Even
out,
Thackeray, in his most
and the
carefully
frightened
written and most
occupants of the house,
artistic
who had
novel,
fled in scant
allowed Henry
attire,
Esmond to
reassembled at
write
dawn to find that
instantly,
little
or as
mischief
soon
had been
as,
done beyond the
whereby he was
cracking of
guilty
window
also of
panes
an
and smoking
anachronism,
of ceilings.
as this
In
blunder
fact,
is a
the chief
Briticism of
sufferer by the
comparatively
fire
recent
was
origin,
Mrs.
and
Manstey,
is not
who
yet
was
to be
found in the
found in the
morning
pages
gasping
of
with
any American
pneumonia,
author of
a
authority.
not unnatural
It is
result,
perhaps
as
worthy
everyone
of note
remarked,
that in the
of her
triumph
having
of
hung out of an
psychological
open window
insight
at her
of
age
Barry
in a
Lyndon,
dressing gown.
which also is written
It
in
was
the first
easy to
person,
see that she
we
was
find
very ill,
light,
but no one
or
had guessed
as
how grave the
much as
doctor's
though it
verdict
were
would
a
be, and
Hibernicism,
the
which
faces
we do
gathered
not
that
understand
evening
it to be.
about Mrs.
I
Sampson's
am
table were
informed
awestruck
and
and
believe,
disturbed.
for in matters of
Not that
language I
any of the
prefer to
boarders knew
testify
Mrs.
on
Manstey
information
well.
and
She
belief
kept to
only, and
herself,
not to make
as they said,
affidavit of my
and
own
seemed to
knowledge,
fancy herself too good for them.
necessarily
But
circumscribed
then
by
it is always
individual
disagreeable to have
experience.
anyone dying in
I
the
am
house,
informed and
and,
believe
as
that an
one lady
Englishman
observed to
says
another,
lift
it
where
might
we
just
say
as well have
elevator,
been you
and that
or
he calls
me, my
that man
dear.
an
But it was
agricultural
only
laborer,
Mrs.
whom
Manstey,
an
and she was
American would
dying,
term a
as she had
farmhand.
lived, lonely,
In the
if
one
not
case the
alone.
Briticism is the shorter,
The doctor
and
had
in the
sent
other
a
the
trained nurse,
Americanism.
and Mrs. Sampson,
I am told
with
that an
muffled step,
Englishman calls
came in
for
from
a
time to
tin of
time,
condensed
but
milk,
both, to
when an
Mrs.
American would
Manstey,
ask for
seemed
a
remote
can,
and
and that
unsubstantial
an
as the figures
Englishman
in a
even
dream.
ventures to taste
All day
tinned
she said
meat,
nothing, but when she was
which we
asked for her
Americans would
daughter's address,
suspect to be
she shook her
tainted
head.
by the metal,
At
although we
times
have no
the nurse
prejudice against
noticed that she seemed to
canned
be
meat.
listening attentively for
I
some sound
understand
which
that
did
an
not come.
Englishman
Then
stops
again
at a
she
hotel
dozed.
at which an
The
American
next
would
morning at
stay.
daylight she was
I
very
have been
low.
led to believe that an
The
English
nurse
woman of
called Mrs.
fashion will go
Sampson,
to a
and as the
swagger
two bent
function
over
at
the
which she
old woman,
will
they
expect
saw
to
her
meet
lips move.
no end of
"Lift
smart
me
people,
up, out
meaning
of bed,"
thereby
she
not
whispered.
clever folks, but
They raised her
swells.
in their arms, and
I
with her
have
stiff
heard that
hand
an
she pointed to
Englishman
the
speaks
window.
of a wire,
"Oh,
meaning a
the
telegram,
window. She wants
and
to sit
I
in the
know that an
window.
English
She used
friend
to
of
sit
mine
there all
in New
day,"
York
Mrs.
received a
Sampson
letter from his
explained.
sister in
"It
London,
can do her
bidding
no
him
harm,
hold
I
himself in
suppose."
readiness to cross the Atlantic
"Nothing
at a
matters
day's
now,"
notice,
said
and
the nurse.
informing him that he
They
might
carried Mrs.
have
Manstey
to
to the
come over
window
on a
and
wire.
placed her in her chair.
To an
The
American,
dawn
going
was
over
abroad,
the
a
ocean on a
jubilant
wire
spring dawn.
seems an
The
unusual mode
spire
of
had
travelling,
already caught a
and too
golden ray,
Blondin-like
though
to
the
be attempted
magnolia
by
and
less
horse
expert
chestnut still
acrobats.
slumbered in shadow. In Mrs. Black's
The
yard
point
all was
halfway
quiet.
between us
The
and
charred
our
timbers of the
adversary
balcony
seems nearer
lay
to
where
him,
they had fallen.
but this is an
It was
optical
evident that since
delusion,
the fire the
just as
oars had
the
not
jet of
returned to
water
their
in the
work.
center of a fountain
The
appears
magnolia
closer
had
to the
unfolded
other side than
a few
to
more
ours,
sculptural flowers.
so
The
it
view
is not
was undisturbed.
easy for anyone on either
It
shore of
was
the
hard for
Atlantic
Mrs.
to
Manstey
be
to breathe.
absolutely
Each
impartial
moment
in
it grew more
considering the
difficult.
speech of those
She
on the
tried
other.
to make them
An
open the
American
window,
with the
but
sense
they
of the
would not
poetic
understand.
cannot but
If she
prefer
could have
to the
tasted
imported
the
word
air,
autumn
sweet
the
with
native and more
penetrating
logical word
ailanthus,
fall, which the
savor,
British have
it
strangely
would have
suffered to
eased her.
drop into
But the
disuse.
view, at
An
least,
American,
was there.
conscious of the
The
fact
spire
that
was
honey
golden
is
now.
frequent
The
in the
heavens
mouths of
had
his fair
warmed from
countrywomen,
pearl to
and
blue.
that it
Day
is
was
sadly
alight from
wrenched
east
from
to
its true
west. Even the
significance,
magnolia
is aware
had caught
also
the
that
sun.
the British are trying to cramp
Mrs.
our mother
Manstey's
tongue
head fell
by
back,
limiting
and
bug
smiling,
to a single
she
offensive
died.
species, by giving to
That day
bloody
the
an
building of the
ulterior
extension
significance
was
as of
resumed.
semi-profanity, and by restricting sick
End
to
of
a single
section
form of
5.
physical
Mrs.
wretchedness,
Manstey's View by
forgetful
Edith
that
Wharton.
Peter's wife's mother once lay sick of a fever, and that an officer in Her Majesty's service may even now go home on sick leave. The ordinary and broader use of sick is not as uncommon in England as some British critics affect to think. I have heard an Englishman defend the use of "I feel bad" for "I feel ill," on the ground that he employed the former phrase only when he was sick enough to be above all thought of grammar. We Americans have extended the meaning of transom, which, strictly speaking, was the bar across the top of a door under the fanlight itself. This American enlargement of the meaning of transom has not found favour at the hands of British critics, who did not protest in any way against the British restriction of the meaning of bug, bloody, and sick. Indeed, in the very number of the London Weekly Review in which we could read a protest against Mr. Howells's employment of transom in its more modern American meaning, was to be seen an advertisement of a journalist in want of a job, and vaunting himself as an expert in the writing of leaderettes. Surely leaderette is as unlovely a vocable as one could find in a Sabbath day's reading, and moreover it is almost unintelligible to an American, who calls that an editorial, which the Englishman calls a leader, and who would term that an editorial paragraph, which the Englishman terms a leaderette. Another sentence, plucked from the pages of the Saturday Review about the same time, is also almost incomprehensible to the ordinary American. But he is so brilliant and so much by way of being complete that they will be few who read his book and do not wish to know more of him. From the context we may hazard a guess that so much by way of being is here synonymous with almost. But what would Lindley Murray say to so vile a phrase? That Lindley Murray, whom the British invoke so often, ignoring or ignorant of the fact that he was an American, holding with the late Richard Grant White that ours is really a grammarless tongue, and distrusting all efforts of schoolmasters to straitjacket our speech into formulas borrowed from the Latin, I, for one, should be quite willing to abandon Lindley Murray to the British. It is not the first time that an American weed has been exhibited in England as a horticultural beauty. Our common wayside mullein, for example, is cherished across the Atlantic as the American velvet plant. Other divergencies of usage may perhaps deserve a passing word. It is an Americanism to call him clever whom we deem good natured only, and it is a Briticism to call that entertainment smart which we consider very fashionable, and of the two the Briticism seems the more natural outgrowth. So also the British terminus of Latin origin is better than the American depot of French origin. It is a wonder that so uncouth an absurdity as depot ever got into use when we had at hand the natural word station. Sometimes the difference between the Americanism and the Briticism is very slight. In America, coal is put on the grate in the singular, while in England coals are put in the grate in the plural. In the United States, beets are served at table as a vegetable, while in Great Britain beet root is served. Oddly enough, the British do not say potato root or carrot root when they order either of those esculents to be cooked, and as the American usage seems the more logical, perhaps it is more likely to prevail. Sometimes, and indeed one might say often, a word or a usage is denounced by some British critic without due examination of the evidence on its behalf. Professor Freeman, for example, who was frequently finicky in his choice of words, objected strongly to the use of metropolis as descriptive of the chief city of a country, rather restricting the word to its more ecclesiastical significance as a cathedral town. And Mr. Skeat has admitted the validity of the objection. But Mr. R. O. Williams, in his recent suggestive paper on Good English for Americans, informs us that metropolis was employed to indicate the most important city of the state by Macaulay, an author most careful in the use of words, and by De Quincey, a purist of the strictest sect. Nay, more, he even finds metropolis thus taken in the prose of Addison and in the verse of Milton. In like manner, Dr. Fitzedward Hall had no difficulty in showing that reliable, often objurgated as an Americanism, is to be found in a letter written in 1624 by one Richard Montague, afterwards a bishop, and that it owes its introduction into literature to Coleridge, who used it in 1800. Dr. Hall has also shown that scientist, which Mr. A. J. Ellis saw fit to denounce as an American barbaric trisyllable, was first used by an Englishman, Dr. Whewell, in 1840. One of the abiding advantages of the New English Dictionary of the Philological Society, an advantage which may more than counterbalance the carelessness with which its quotations have been verified, is that its columns can be used to convince even the ordinary British critic that many a word and many an expression which he is prompt to condemn as an Americanism, and therefore pestilent, is to be found in the literature of our language long before the Declaration of Independence broke the political unity of the Anglo-Saxon race. And although a negative is always difficult of proof, this same New English Dictionary gives evidence in behalf of the late Mr. White's contention that Britisher is not an Americanism, but a Briticism. He said that the word was never heard in the mouth of an American, and, as it happens, Dr. Murray is not able to adduce it in its behalf a single quotation from any American author. The effort for precision, the desire to make a word do more than is set down for it, the wish to have warrant for every syllable, is neither despicable nor futile. It is only by taking thought that language can be bent to do our will. The sparse vocabulary and the rude idioms of the shepherd or the teamster are inadequate to the needs of the poet and of the student. The ideal of style is said to be the speech of the people in the mouth of the scholar. And Walter Bagehot, in his essay on Sterne and Thackeray, one of the few of his papers which have art and form as well as sympathy and insight, declares that how language was first invented and made we may not know, but beyond doubt it was shaped and fashioned into its present state by common ordinary men and women using it for common and ordinary purposes. They wanted a carving knife, not a razor or lancet. And those great artists who have to use language for more exquisite purposes, who employ it to describe changing sentiments and momentary fancies, and the fluctuating and indefinite inner world, must use curious nicety and hidden but effectual artifice, else they cannot duly punctuate their thoughts and slice the fine edges of their reflections. A hair's breadth is as important to them as a yard's breadth to a common workman. To put so sharp a point upon his style, the artist in words must choose his material with unfaltering care. He must select and store away in his script the best words. He must free his vocabulary from clumsy localisms, whether these be Americanisms or Briticisms. He must be true to the inherent and vital principles of our language, not yielding to temporary defections from the truth, whether these flourish in Great Britain or in the United States. It cannot be said too often that there is no basis for the belief that somewhere there exists a sublimated English language, perfect and impeccable. This is the flawless ideal to which all artists in style strive vainly to attain, whether they are Englishmen or Americans, Australians or Canadians, Irish or Scotch. But nowhere in this speech without stain spoken by man in his daily life. Not in London, where Cockneyisms abound; not in Oxford, where university slang is luxuriant, and where pedantry flourishes. Nowhere has this pure and undefiled language ever been spoken by any community. Nowhere will it ever be spoken other than by a few men here and there, gifted by nature or trained by art. The speech of the people in the mouth of the scholar, that is the absolute ideal which no man can find by travel, and which every man must make for himself by toil, avoiding alike the tendency of the people towards slouching inaccuracy, and the tendency of the scholar towards academic frigidity. Of the two, the more wholesome leaning is towards the forcible idioms of the plain people rather than the tamer precision of the student. The wild flowers of speech, plucked betimes with the dew still on them, humble and homely and touching, such as we find in Franklin and in Emerson, in Lowell and in Thoreau, are to be preferred infinitely before the waxen petals of rhetoric as a schoolmaster arranges them. The grammarian, the purist, the pernickety stickler for trifles, is the deadly foe of good English, rich in idioms and racy of the soil. Every man who has taught himself to know good English, and to love it, and to delight in it, must sympathize with Professor Lounsbury's lack of admiration for that grammar school training which consists in teaching the pupil how much more he knows about our tongue than the great masters who have moulded it, which practically sets up the claim that the only men who are able to write English properly are the men who have never shown any capacity to write it at all. As to the English of the future, who knows what the years may bring forth? The language is alive and growing and extending on all sides, to the grief of the purist and the pedant, who prefer a dead language that they can dissect at will, and that has come to the end of its usefulness. The existence of Briticisms and of Americanisms and of Australianisms is a sign of healthy vitality. Neither usage, said Professor Freeman, after contrasting certain Americanisms and Briticisms, can be said to be in itself better or worse than the other. Each usage is the better in the land in which it has grown up of itself. An unprejudiced critic, if such a one could happily be found, would probably discover an equality of blemish on either side of the ocean, more precision and pedantry on the one side, and a more daring carelessness on the other. To declare a single standard of speech is impossible. That there will ever be any broad divergence between the English language and American speech, such, for example, as differentiates the Portuguese from the Spanish, is now altogether unlikely. A divergence as wide as this has been impossible since the invention of printing, and it is even less possible since the schoolmaster has been abroad teaching the same ABC in London, New York, Sydney, and Calcutta. Although it has ceased absolutely to be British, the chief literature of North America is still English, and must remain so, just as the chief literature of South America is still Spanish. Señor Juan Valera, declaring this truth in the preface to his delightful Pepita Ximenez, reminds us that the literature of Syracuse, of Antioch, and of Alexandria was as much Greek literature as was the literature of Athens. In like manner we may recall the fact that Lucan, Seneca, Martial, and Quintilian were all of them Spaniards by birth. That any one country shall remain or become at once the political, financial, and literary centre of the wide series of Anglo Saxon states which now encircles the globe is almost equally unlikely. But we may be sure that that branch of our Anglo Saxon stock will use the best English, and will perhaps see its standards of speech accepted by the other branches, which is most vigorous physically, mentally, and morally, which has the most intelligence, and which knows its duty best and does it most fearlessly. End of Section 6. Americanisms and Briticisms by Brander Matthews.